Making it official, 2020 presidential hopeful Beto O'Rourke just wrapped up his first of 3 campaign kickoffs across the state in Texas today. Hi, everyone. I'm Rena 9. And during his first stop in his hometown of El Paso, O'Rourke spoke to thousands of supporters. He spoke about his vision for universal health care for all Americans. He talked about equal pay and, of course, tackling the issue of climate change. And he also mentioned immigration policy as well as veterans issues. For more on this, I want to bring in Scott Braddock. He joins us from Houston, Texas. He's actually editor of Quorum Report. So, Scott, Beto O'Rourke, this is one of his first sort of campaign kickoffs today. What about these events are different when he officially announces? Usually candidates have one large event. Why do you decide to do 3?
Well, he's got the eyes of the nation on Texas today in El Paso, where he's from, and then he'll be here in the largest city in Texas, Houston, where I'm speaking to you from today a little bit later, and then the most liberal city in Texas, Austin, later this evening. And he's got, the energy here behind him. If you look at what's going on with O'Rourke, it's not so much that he's kicking off the campaign as he's doing sort of a show of force to try to say that he is the Texas candidate, if you will. Of course, as you know, there is one other Texan running as well, former San Antonio mayor and HUD head Julian Castro running as well, and he's going to be doing an event later, I think on April 10th, which is, if I have this right, it's the same day that Donald Trump's going to be doing a campaign swing or a fundraising swing through Texas as well, I think here in Houston and one other city. So it could be a preview of 2020 and how important Texas is going to be. Look, you had O'Rourke saying that we have, a richness of electoral votes in this state, 38 electoral votes. And he's trying to make the case, and you'll see Castro doing this as well, that Texas is going to be pivotal because they want to, be the nominee, and they have some competition here in Texas. Kamala Harris, who, is the senator from California, making it clear that she's not just going to stand by and let these guys have their own home state of Texas. She was here just recently making an appeal to African-American voters in Texas. So we're right in the mix of it all here.
We're seeing him with his wife, Amy, there, who actually introduced him and his family all on stage there. You mentioned how Texas will be so instrumental likely in this upcoming election. But talk to me a little bit about the fact, Beto did incredibly well, but he did not secure the Senate seat for his state. Right. How do you think he'll fare as he branches off, especially because he can't claim Texas his own? He's got Julian Castro there. He might have momentum. But how do you think he'll fare when it comes to the other states?
Well, he had started his campaign, before this series of kickoff rallies. He was in Iowa and some other states, New Hampshire as well, where he got a lot of questions about his past. Of course, once you become a presidential candidate, once you throw your hat in the ring officially, you start to get the real scrutiny that goes along with being a presidential candidate. And as you remember, Rena, you had O'Rourke having to apologize for a lot of the things that he has done, previously. But, he was a part of a hacker group that when he was a teenager, then had written some very offensive things when he was a kid. He said that he was horrified by looking at some of that stuff. Now, there were also headlines about whether he was letting his wife speak enough. And, of course, you saw her speaking at the rally today, something you had not seen before. And O'Rourke almost on an apology tour for a little while there. But, of course, his supporters don't seem to care about that. You see them showing up en masse in El Paso. We expect the same thing later in Houston later today and in Austin as well. And they didn't care when it came to fundraising either, right, because he was able to raise more than Bernie Sanders, $6.1 million coming in for O'Rourke in the first 24 hours of his campaign, a little bit more than Bernie Sanders, as I mentioned. And like Bernie Sanders, this was from small donors mainly. I think the average donor to O'Rourke's campaign gave about $47, $48, something like that, which means he can go back to those folks again and again to raise money. And I'm sure it's no coincidence that the series of rallies in Texas comes right as the fundraising quarter is coming to an end.
You mentioned a little bit about how he was kind of on an apology tour at one point. When you talk about O'Rourke, a lot of people say, what are his issues? What does he stand for? Was he able to clarify any of that in his opening act here today?
I think what you heard from him was a litany of what you're hearing from a lot of the other Democratic candidates. O'Rourke is a Texas Democrat, which means that if you look at his voting record, it's probably a little more conservative than some of the other candidates who are in this race, certainly more conservative than Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren, for example. But suddenly he's embracing things like the new Green Deal. The Green New Deal, rather, that has been pushed by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. So he's going to try to get to the left of where he has been been before, because, of course, a Democratic primary largely is about that, about being more liberal than the folks that you're running against in the Democratic primary. And look, this is also a lot about border issues. I mean, he's kicking this off in El Paso. It's, border city, and border issues and immigration have been put front and center by the president. And you heard O'Rourke forcefully saying that those folks who have been detained along the border, those folks who last year were, at the center of the family separations on the border, O'Rourke saying that those are our fellow human beings and they need to be treated as such.
In the latest Quinnipiac poll, if you check it out, O'Rourke is at 12%. People supporting him. It's actually near the top of the list for Democratic candidates. Yeah. What do you think it is about O'Rourke that's resonating with voters?
He has that it factor. It's interesting. No matter what seems to happen so far on the campaign anyway, despite that apology tour that we talked about, the folks that you see there in El Paso, very excited about him. And the folks who are donating to his campaign, very excited about him, even though he doesn't seem to be, staking out any new positions here. And look, we should say, and probably should have said this at the beginning, this is someone who helped to change the dynamic of this state politically in a huge way. O'Rourke was able to take Democrats 5 years ago from losing every statewide race in Texas by 21 points to last year coming within 3 points of beating a statewide candidate in Ted Cruz. And as O'Rourke mentioned, that changed the composition of the Texas legislature. There are now 12 more Democrats than there were in the last legislative session in the Texas House. There's 2 more Democrats in the Texas Senate than there were 2 years ago. And in large part, that's thanks to O'Rourke. He really helped to, I'm not sure if he made the state purple just yet, but the dynamic in Texas is more complex than it used to be when it was simply Republicans dominating everything. But we should also remember there were 2 other people really helping O'Rourke with that, and those were President Trump. There's a lot of backlash to President Trump, and there's a lot of backlash to Senator Cruz as well, who doesn't enjoy huge support even from some Republicans, and so that's part of what was hurting him. And of course, Cruz will not be on the ballot in 2020.
Scott Braddock, grateful you could join us, Scott.
Thank you, Rena.